And that was our correspondent there with yesterday's close for the U.S. markets. Moving on to our next conversation now, we see the U.S. Congress is pressing President Joe Biden to take a tougher stance against South Africa over its deepening ties to Russia and China. Let's talk to Matt Kinniger now, practice leader at Sub-Saharan Africa Front of View. Great to have you, Matt. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me on the show today.
So quite an interesting turn of events there. You know, we've had Russia with their friendly and non-friendly nations, and now it's looking most likely that South Africa may be at risk of sanctions due to the ties with Russia. How are you seeing this?
Yes, so this is something that I wouldn't have imagined only a couple of months ago, but there is increasing risk that the US will impose some kind of penalty or sanctions on South Africa because of its deepening ties with Russia. I will emphasize it is not our base case for the time being, but there is increasing risk that we will see some kind of action by the US against South Africa. To put this into context, it appears that President Biden is resisting calls from Congress to impose sanctions or tougher penalties, and this is because his presidency has really been defined, especially with relation to Africa, of improving relations or trying to improve the US's standing in Africa. So he wants to really encourage, through diplomatic channels, South Africa to sort of distance itself from Russia rather than use punitive measures. Having said all of this, if we see South Africa, or if we see very clear evidence of South Africa supplying lethal aid, military aid to to Russia, then we are likely to see Biden face overwhelming pressure from Republicans in Congress to impose some sort of sanctions on South Africa. Now, it will be quite difficult for the US to get the UK on board because the UK has a much closer political, trade, cultural investment ties with South Africa. And so the US will probably not want to do this unilaterally. But again, if there is evidence of lethal aid being supplied to Russia, then we're likely to see some form of sanctions imposed on South Africa.
It looks quite difficult, knowing that both countries are in the same bloc. They're talking about BRICS. But how do you see this impacting, if these sanctions actually do happen, how does this impact the South Africa's growth outlook?
Yeah, so what I would say is that if there are sanctions imposed, we're much more likely to see lighter sanctions imposed, at least initially, and these are much more likely to be on specific individuals, so top politicians, civil servants, and members of the military in South Africa. In that case, we would certainly see a sharp depreciation of the rand, but overall, the effects would be mainly limited to sentiment. As we saw with Russia, even though sanctions before the war in Ukraine started were negative for the economy, they weren't really game-changing for the economy or extremely disruptive. However, if we were to see broader sanctions targeting specific industries such as the country's very sophisticated and large banking sector, or, for example, sanctions restricting South Africa's exports of commodities such as iron ore, then we would see very severe and lasting damage to the economy. We would likely see South Africa enter a very sharp recession. Public finances would deteriorate very substantially. So that's a significant downside risk for the country, especially because South Africa's economy is very globally integrated. One thing I would also emphasize is that even if we don't see very severe sanctions, so sector by sector sanctions imposed on South Africa, if they are just lighter sanctions, there would also be a negative effect on tourism, in our view, because European, North American tourists would be very sensitive to this development. We would also see a number of companies, especially in the West, starting to self-sanction. So there was a risk that you would see divestment from South Africa, even if they wouldn't be legally required to. So there is certainly a risk nonetheless.
Right, and definitely a risk there. But before I let you go quickly now, what's your expectations for the economy, regardless of the sanctions?
Yeah, so unfortunately, South Africa's economic growth outlook is looking increasingly weak. We have recently downgraded our growth outlook for South Africa from about 1.7% this year to just about 1%, and we are likely to downgrade this further. And this is mainly because of the increasing electricity shortages in the country. This is having a very negative impact on mining and manufacturing. Sentiment is also being affected generally from an investor portfolio perspective. But we also have very weak labour markets in South Africa. There's also a relatively muted tourism outlook. And public finances, unfortunately, are deteriorating as well in the country. There are still sectors doing quite well. Services are still performing quite well in the market. Healthcare, for example, doing very well. But overall, our base case view is that the economy will struggle to grow this year, even if there are no sanctions imposed on the country.
All right. Thank you so much, Matt, right there in the UK. Matt Kinga, practice leader, Sub-Saharan Africa Frontier View. It was great having your perspective, and have a great weekend.
Thank you, you too.
All right.